They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
A young man from Bonavista who was a bank clerk. He was killed in action a few months later on November 27th, 1915. He's buried here at Asmak Cemetery, Suvla, Turkey.
Captain Charles Whiten, Newfoundland Regiment. Enlisted St. John's September 1st, 1914. He was killed in action November 25th, 1915, and was the first officer of the regiment killed in action.
Private John Fitzgerald, Newfoundland Regiment. Killed in action December 1st, 1915 as a stretcher bearer while tending to wounded.
Number 44, Private John Dunphy, Newfoundland Regiment, enlisted age 20, St. John's, October 1st, 1914. Killed in action December 12th, 1915 by a bullet wound to the head that glanced off of a periscope held by a sentry.
William Frank Hardy, he landed in Gallipoli on September the 19th, 1915, and he was killed in action on September the 23rd.
We're at the grave of Private George Sims. His hometown was Pilley's Island, and on his gravestone it says, "Pride of our home was he. We gave him up, O God, for country and for thee."
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Where are you going, young fellow, my lad, on this glittering morn of May? I'm going to join the colors, Dad. They're looking for men, they say. But you're only a boy, young fellow, my lad. You're not obligated to go. I'm 17 and a quarter, Dad, and ever so strong, you know. So you're off to France, young fellow, my lad.
My name is Michael Pretty, and I retired as a major from the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And before that, I served for 28 years in Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and I currently live in Portugal Cove, Newfoundland. The Trail of the Caribou Research Group is a registered charity, not-for-profit organization. It's ran 100% by volunteers, and we exist to make sure that the deeds of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians in foreign wars or at home are remembered.
Look at the history here. We got Korea, Vietnam, World War I, World War II, and a death in World War I at the defining moment of Newfoundland history, I suppose, which was Beaumont Hamel.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Okay?
Yeah.
So the rest of the stone is here, down below, and I can make out John.
In September of 2022, we traveled to Turkey, and specifically the Gallipoli Peninsula, with a group of 33 Newfoundlanders to commemorate the 7th Caribou and the Trail of the Caribou monuments to the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. One of the key things we had was a wreath program. The wreath program was, we're gonna take a wreath, put a soldier's picture on it, and lay it on every grave of every Newfoundlander that's buried on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And there's 25 of them. 22 from the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, 2 that were in the British Army, 1 that was in the Australian Army.
I'm here because my grandfather was here in 1915. My grandfather's name was Howard Leopold Morey. He was from Ferryland on the southern shore of Newfoundland. And I was here 100 years later on the 20th of September 2015 to commemorate the landing of the Newfoundland Regiment in Suvla Bay on Kangaroo Beach.
I had a great uncle on my mother's side of the family, William Edward Lashana, who fought in Gallipoli and subsequently fought in Beaumont Hamel, and like many other Newfoundlanders was one of the casualties of war there.
On my father's side, his uncle who came home really would not talk of the war. I think he probably had what we would now call PTSD. And he was very, very young when he went. His name was Herbert Parsons. He was born on Christmas Day in 1900. So he was still 13 years old when he enlisted. Within a year, he was here in Gallipoli. So he was not quite 15 when he came here and saw what he saw and lived what he lived. And I don't know how. I mean, that's a boy, that's a child.
Most of them lied about their age. They were only 16, 17 years old. But they always lied about, my father lied about his age. He was 16 when he joined.
All of the soldiers who went on that expedition were really, really young, about my age. I don't think I'd have the courage or bravery to go into it knowing that there was a high chance I would die. I think that makes them very strong and brave.
I'm sure he signed up like a lot of the boys did for the adventure. The war was going to be over in no time, and a bit of a lark to go over to Europe maybe and see what the world was like. And that's not what he got at all.
And then you look at Newfoundlanders, you know, boys from the Bay or boys from town who had never left, like, you know, their life was 100 kilometers left and right of their towns. And now they're riding a camel in the pyramids, or they're in Alexandria, or they're sailing by the hills of Gibraltar going into the Mediterranean, and they're fighting in this foreign land against people, you know. What's a Turk? The Great War, World War I, as it's now known, broke out as a result of the monarchy and empires in Europe flexing its muscles and wanting to grow and expand. Oddly enough, they were all related, right? All the kings were cousins of all the great empires. So what's called the Central Powers would be Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And then later on, others joined that side. And on the other side were the Allies, which mainly comprised of the United Kingdom and the Empire. The Empire, or the Commonwealth as we now know it, back then was massive, but it consisted of 7 main distinct countries. First of all, the United Kingdom, India, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and the Dominion of Newfoundland. As well, France and Belgium and Russia. Later on in the war, in October, Italy joined, and as the war progressed throughout the years, other countries joined both sides. Interestingly enough, the Ottoman Empire wanted to be neutral, but in October of 1914, they joined the Central Powers. They had been courted by both sides, the Allies and the Central Powers, but when the Ottomans had ordered 2 warships from the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom were worried about which side the Ottomans were going to veer towards, so they confiscated those 2 warships. The Germans actually had military attachés and advisors embedded with the Turkish military, and they had invested in their civilian infrastructure of railroads and roads and that kind of stuff. When the call came out, men from all over Newfoundland and Labrador answered the call. And later on in the war, there was hundreds of women who joined as well to serve in various roles. So they came from everywhere. They sailed, they walked, they took trains, and they all came to St. John's to sign up, because this is where the recruiting center was. Back then, it was cool to believe in your king and your country and the empire. It was an adventure, and it was a well-paid job. Actually, Newfoundland soldiers got paid more than soldiers in other Commonwealth countries. An adventure that would be over by Christmas. And some people just needed to eat. They were hungry. They encamped down by Kitividi, which is we call Pleasantville today, and they lived in bell tents. There were cookhouses and rifle ranges and that kind of stuff. They mainly trained in the White Hills and down around Pleasantville. So there's this whole unique story, I guess, to Newfoundland about how the regiment was kitted out and how people just came together and just did it. The regimental officers down in Pleasantville get a picture with the governor. And in this picture, there are several officers in regimental uniforms. But you look at all the other officers that are all in the regiment, and some are still have their Navy uniform on because they don't have a regimental one yet. And there's Catholic Cadet Corps uniforms in there, and there's Methodist Guards, and there's the Church Lads Brigade, and there's a Legion of Frontiersmen, and there's a Newfoundland Highlanders. So it's that picture that kind of shows that this piecemeal of uniforms and getting whatever they had to go and fight, they just did it. There was a folklore that there wasn't enough khaki-colored uniforms, so they made stuff out of blue, which is kind of true but not 100% accurate. So the actual story of the blue puttees and their origin is related in a letter by P.C. Mars on the 15th of February 1930 to the Telegram. And in the telegram, he relates the story of how him and his buddy J.G. McNeil served in the Boer War. And during the Boer War, they were in the Colonial Division, and several units in that division wore blue puttees. And they were really distinctive. They really stood out. Mars and McNeil, because they had military service, would probably have known what a soldier's outfit would look like. So that's why they were chosen to be the people on the equipment committee. And Mars ended up being the first regimental quartermaster. He relates in his letter that there was no woolen khaki material in Newfoundland at the time. They actually had to make them uniforms from cotton khaki drill material. Drill meaning D-R-I-L-L. So it's a lower quality material. After the decision was made to go with blue puttees, they went to sources of blue puttees, such as the Church Lads Brigade, and they went to the Navy because they were issued with blue puttees. And when they ran out of those, they went to the hospital and got blue bandages that were very similar. And when they ran out of those, then they made more blue puttees out of local material. Hence the legend that we know of today. The reason they wanted the blue puttees was to stand out, so they wouldn't be confused as Canadians or British soldiers. So it was their decision to go with that and the Australian slouch hat. Unfortunately, the slouch hat never showed up in time before they left, so that wasn't part of their uniform when they left here. And interestingly enough, when they got to England, they gave them proper uniforms, and they looked at their leggings and went, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Because wartime effort, we're going to make one color and that's it, and everybody's going to wear the same. There were several times the Newfoundland soldiers left to go overseas, and the first one was in October. And it was a massive celebration. They marched from Pleasantville down by Kitty Vitty up to Government House, and were reviewed, and then down to the pier and onto the Florizel. And the streets were lined with families and cheering members and merchants and all the citizenry of St. John's. And every time that a contingent went or left, or a draft they would call them, there was a similar parade. So it was a very big affair. So the first 500, and there were actually 537 of them, they boarded the Florizel on the night of the 3rd of October, and they sailed the next morning on the 4th. And they arrived in England on the night of the 19th of October, and they disembarked on the day of the 20th. They went to Salisbury Plain, and then later on that year, they went in December up to Fort George in Scotland, where they were in charge of garrisoning Fort George and monitoring the seaplane base. Early February, they went to Edinburgh Castle. And this was the first time that a non-Highland unit garrisoned Edinburgh Castle. And then in May, they went to Stobbs Camp, which is about 80 kilometers south of Edinburgh. And they stayed there until August. And that's when they did rifle training, shooting, assault training, training in throwing grenades, digging trenches, proper defensive works. And that's where they basically turned into being soldiers. The British wanted the Ottoman Empire out of the war, so that was the intent, and they also wanted to open the Black Sea route to help resupply the Russians easier, as opposed to going all the way up around Norway into Murmansk. So at the time, Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, suggested a quick rush up the Dardanelles with a whole bunch of naval power to capture Constantinople. They were using a lot of old plans or old maps. They had originally proposed this same kind of operation years ago, and everybody said, nope, this is not going to work, it's silly. But it was going to be quick and decisive, and they looked at all the forts and the guns that were defending the Dardanelles, and they were old. Like out of the 100 plus guns, there were only 16 that were modern day guns that had a range of more than maybe, say, 6 or 7 miles. The rest were short range, old weapons. It's interesting because if you look at that now, you would say, who would do this? But back then, there was a contempt for the Ottomans, right? Oh, or we're the British Navy and the French Navy, we can just blast our way through this. Look at their old guns, look at this, they're not going to fight. And it was a combination of British and French battleships in 4 lines that went up. Two British battleships were sunk, the Irresistible and the Ocean, and another one was severely damaged. Some through artillery, but they also laid minefields. This little ship called the Nunzerat, it went out and laid whatever mines it had left. Fortunately for the Turkish forces, but unfortunately for the French, the Bouvet hit one of these mines and was sunk. They had these trawlers from England called Grimsby trawlers manned by civilians. And the trawlers were ineffective because there's a current that comes in the Dardanelles and they had a hard time fighting the current. They would be engaged from shore batteries and small arms fire. So they pulled out. They couldn't do it. So at the end of the 18th of March, which is a national holiday in that part of Turkey, for 118 Turkish soldiers that lost their lives, they inflicted over 700 casualties on the British and French navies. They sank 3 major warships and severely damaged 3 more, and several other ships had minor damage.
When the Irresistible was sunk over there was a fellow by the name of Richard Alexander Howley on it. And he was born in 1879 in St. John's, Newfoundland. He was severely wounded, but he managed to make sure all of his men got out of the engine rooms and to safety. And it was after that injury that he was determined unable to sail anymore. The story's not over.
After the Dardanelles and his injury, he is seconded to the Canadian Navy for training. He was blown up in the Halifax explosion and suffered more injuries while rescuing people from damaged buildings. He goes on to Esquimalt, has a son, comes back to Newfoundland. He runs the Veterans magazine, does all kinds of veterans outreach and helps veterans from the war. He then goes back to England. World War II starts, and he volunteers at the local recruiting office, ends up running a POW camp for a good part of the war, but unfortunately he passes before the war ends. The Allies decided, well, we're going to do a land campaign and we're going to neutralize the forts and neutralize the threat to the Navy so the Navy can go up and take Constantinople. Luck would have it that en route to France and Flanders is the Anzac Corps in Egypt. As well, there's a 29th Division that's been sent there, and some French regiments and the British Royal Naval Division are also stationed in Egypt. So they're chosen to make up the assault troops for the invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. On the 25th of April, the French land on the Asian side as a diversion, and also northwest of Hellas. And Hellas is the main point, like at the bottom of the peninsula. So the French are doing that. So at the same time, at the point on Hellas, the British 29th Division are landing on various beaches around there. And then up further north along the Aegean side, in what we know as Anzac Cove today, the Anzac Corps are landing. So it all happens on the 25th of April. It wasn't a stealth operation. They tried to use surprise as best they could, but you've got hundreds and hundreds of ships coming across the ocean approaching the Gallipoli Peninsula. There are German staff officers there. There are some pretty good Turkish officers there. So they've been waiting and ready for this. And there are horrific casualties on both sides of the landing. Some beaches are unopposed, some beaches are heavily defended, and very few, if any, of the initial objectives for day one are met, and there's heavy losses on both sides. So the Newfoundland Regiment was the only regiment from Newfoundland, obviously. And they had finished all their training and they were down in Camp Aldershot in the southern England, right? And they don't know what to do with them. On the initial landings on the 25th of April, there was a Scottish battalion with the 29th Division, and they suffered horrendous losses and horrendous casualties in April, May, and June. It was decided they need to be replaced. The Royal Scots Regiment had numerous battalions available, and they were fighting all over the place in the British Army. And the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots was chosen to replace the Scottish battalion with over there. And this was in early May, this decision was made. Unfortunately, on the 22nd of May, in a place called Quintus Hill, which is next to Gretna Green in England, there was the largest train disaster ever in English history. 3 trains all collided at the same time. 270 odd men were killed. 214 of them were from the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots. So they weren't going to replace the Scottish battalion over there because they were already probably combat ineffective at the time. So they looked around, and here's this Newfoundland regiment, now highly trained. They'd been in England for about a year or so, and they were chosen to go to Gallipoli. Later on in August in Aldershot, Lord Kitchener was addressing the battalion. Kitchener has said, "I'm sending you to the Dardanelles, boys. Sharpen those bayonets for the Turks." And when the parade dismissed, one soldier looked at another soldier and said, "What the hell's a Turk?"
It still had not been revealed what lay ahead for them. As the weeks passed, they grew more and more anxious to get into it, whatever it was. And in August of 1915, by which time they had moved to Aldershot for a final polish on their training.
So the 29th Division commander gives the 88th Brigade commander written orders that the Newfoundland Regiment is coming, and they were to incorporate the Newfoundland Regiment into the 88th Brigade, which is replacing the Royal Scots who had left in July. And later on, they sailed out of England into Egypt, into Alexandria, and then took a train over to Cairo to become acclimatized and get their equipment ready. So they learned about fighting in a desert climate. They were given desert types of uniforms, pith helmets, and different types of clothing, shorts as opposed to pants. And on the 13th of April, they left Cairo and they went through a series of islands. And then on the night of the 19th/20th of September, they were put ashore in Kangaroo Beach. And it's a harbor, it's not like an assault beach.
But I just couldn't help but think about those poor men that were coming ashore on those beaches. My grandfather was one of them. He was one of over 1,000 Newfoundland soldiers that landed on Kangaroo Beach.
We're at Kangaroo Beach. We've just laid a wreath for all the Newfoundlanders that landed here, one of them being my grandfather, William Dalton. He did survive, and he came home, and here we are.
As they were moving off the beach, the adjutant, Captain Randall, and 8 others were wounded, but luckily there were no fatalities.
This was the first time the Newfoundland Regiment was in battle. This is what christened them to war. This is what took the romance out of war for them and showed them the harsh reality of what war really is.
This was their first opportunity to actually show what they were made of. And I think the realities of a battlefield were very disheartening for them, and the romanticism of it all just disappeared in so many ways.
So when the Newfoundland Regiment showed up to become part of the 88th Brigade, they just did the same job as any other infantry battalion over there. They were in the trenches, 4 days in the front line, 4 days in the reserve trench, and then back in the reserve area, not the reserve trench, but back where usually it's supposed to be safe, but there was no place that was safe because they were constantly artillery and shelled. And it was supposed to be for rest, but there was no rest because you were constantly moving supplies, unloading boats, loading boats, or digging more trenches or making it safe for you to live there. The Australian Army actually got their nickname the Digger because they dug so much to be safe over there. That's where that term, the Digger, comes from.
One of the war poets, A.P. Herbert, wrote that, and he was in Gallipoli and the Somme, and he said the Somme was nothing compared to Gallipoli. He said at least at the Somme you could go back out of the, do your time out of the trenches, back in the villages where you were billeted. But that option didn't exist in Gallipoli. When you had your days out of the trench, you were still within range of shells and snipers and everything else.
And then on the 22nd of September, the regiment suffered its first combat casualty, which was Private Hugh McQuirter.
Enlisted St. John's, January 4th, 1915, age 20. First member of the Newfoundland Regiment killed in combat in World War I. Buried Hill 10 Cemetery, Suvla, Turkey.
Yes,
For people who have never been to Gallipoli, there's lots of hills like this, right? And even though you've got to take an objective that's maybe 750 meters away, you got to walk 2 kilometers to get there. And you got to fight up a cliff, down a cliff, up a cliff, down a cliff. And as you're trying to go up that hill, you're tired, you're in a weakened physical condition because of no food and sickness and dysentery and malnutrition. And you get to the top and there's another place to go, or people are just like leaning down and shooting at you. And in parts of that, they still won. They still took the hill. They had a whole underground fortress built, and they fought the Turks off, and then there was horrific fighting for 3 or 4 days, and then they lost it because you couldn't reinforce it.
I was a soldier, so I know some of the things that these men went through, and then looking at the ground and how difficult the terrain is here, and then the hardships that they must have endured while fighting through Gallipoli. I mean, it's almost unimaginable.
On the 23rd, we lost 2 more Newfoundlanders. One is Private Ebsbury, who dies of meningitis in Egypt, and the other one is Private Hardy, who was killed in action. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there were a lot of Newfoundlanders who didn't go to Gallipoli, like transportation. There was no need for transportation. So there were 18 who served in the Composite Battalion of the Western Frontier Force. And they were there for protection of the flank of the Allied soldiers there. We're people of the sea. We never had a standing army in Newfoundland just before World War I. So the only way that you could serve in Newfoundland was the Royal Naval Reserve. There were Newfoundlanders in the British Navy. We know for sure of 37 that served on various ships in the Gallipoli campaign. Some of them were part of rowing people ashore in the boats. There were Newfoundlanders in the Australian Army. There's one buried in Gallipoli.
Private Walter John Wardrop was in the Australian forces of the 16th Infantry Battalion. His hometown was St. John's, Newfoundland. He was living in South Torrens, Australia when he enlisted at the age of 33. He was killed in action on the 29th of April 1915, 4 days after the landing. He's buried here in Beach Cemetery, Gallipoli, grave 1B9.
Captain Carl de Follett was in the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment. He was born in Bombay, India, and he worked for several years in a bank in St. John's, Newfoundland.
Out of the hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers and seamen, there must have been more than these 3 Newfoundlanders that served in other militaries. We just don't know who, because we haven't had time to research all those service records. So there were so many people from this province.
We're Newfoundlanders, we, especially back in those days, I mean, we were used to hard times, we were used to hard living, bad weather, being out on the water, cutting wood, growing your own vegetables, pulling fish from the sea. We're just a hardy people, Newfoundlanders, and, we take a bad situation and we make it better.
We have a saying home that most Newfoundlanders could put an arse in a cat, and it just means that they can turn their hand to any task at hand. So from the digging of the trenches to the drill to whatever needed to be done, they were the type of people who could adapt and get the job done.
In reality, this kind of high ground is where the British would have occupied, right? The patrol would have left about a couple of hundred meters that way.
So Caribou Hill, there was a part of the front line where the Turkish soldiers would come out towards the evening and occupy it and snipe. And they would snipe at the positions and cause a lot of havoc. So the Newfoundland Regiment was tasked to go up and put an end to this. So Lieutenant Donnelly led a force up and the idea was to occupy where the Turkish soldiers would occupy and wait for them to show up and ambush them when they tried to occupy the positions. Their planning map was just a sketch that had all the dry ravines marked on there. They crossed the British front lines. On the way up, he ran into opposition. There's some pretty close combat. There's people running out of bullets and trying to get more. They've used all their grenades. They're being reinforced. There were some people wounded. Lots of fighting going on. And then Lieutenant Ross, with another group of Newfoundland soldiers, was sent in to help. And they ended up capturing this place that we now know as Caribou Hill. And they kept that for the entire time they occupied that part. They had something to prove. This is their first gallantry medals, right? So a small patrol, hand-picked men, go out, and they want to stop their friends from getting killed. So they want to take this sniper position. The battle goes on all night long. We suffer a couple of casualties, one killed in action. And you can see where the different trenches were on this map. And if you angle it and measure the distances, some people claim that this is the closest the Allies ever got to Constantinople. The reason we know where Caribou Hill is today is mainly because of the work of Frank Gogus and David Mercer. The patrol report has a dry well and a bearing and a distance to every trench. So we were able to plot the trenches on the ground through just map interpretation. And when we were there, we actually found some of the trenches.
If you look at this, see how it's elongated and square? That to me would be a trench. There's another one up there, but as the ground keeps growing over here, and see the white rock over there?
So this is what I saw first that caught my eye. And this is kind of what Michael said to look for, and definitely a hole in the middle. I'm happy to stand in the middle of a trench where my relatives may have stood 100 years ago, where once they stood.
So that's a fragment from one of the standard issue rum jars. So they had ceramic jars, jugs really, that were about this big. And they brought them up from the landing zones up here. And all the soldiers got one shot of rum every day, midday. And that was to boost morale, give them something to look forward to. When we often find them in these stream beds in the ravines, because the rain washes them down.
This is a button from an English uniform that our guide Boulent found. I can't read the writing on it.
That has a crown on top, so it's British.
Got a shrapnel ball. Would have exploded up in the air and rained down.
I think that after all of these years, to be able to find relics or battle memento just brings you that much closer, and perhaps helps a little bit more with the realization that although this is history, it was very, very real and nerve-wracking and in some cases very damaging experience for many of the people that served here.
Okay, so we're going to read the act, and Boulent is going to lay the wreath for us.
They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
I think it's the same. No, it's a well. The blockhouse here was the landmark. And there were trenches. And hey, Michael, which direction were the trenches going?
So they kind of came down that way and then snaked across here, and the blockhouse was the front trench for us, then it went back that way. And the Turks were about maybe a couple hundred yards over there, and the well was in the middle. And it became a bone of contention.
So you've got this blockhouse, right? And it's on the corner of a line, and there's a well right beside it. So what's the biggest commodity in Gallipoli that soldiers want? Water. And every time they try to leave the front lines to get to the well by the blockhouse, they were shot at. So how agonizing would that have been? And the blockhouse, it was an easy identifiable landmark. It wasn't a major battle, it was just one of so many things that happened. I think as a soldier, the blockhouse was a known thing. The key focus there was getting enough water to drink. We have a depleted regiment. They're sick, they're malnourished. They've been working in hot weather. They have tropical gear. Some of them have shorts and pith helmets or light jackets. And then there's a freak storm in November. It rains, torrential downpour of rain. Soldiers are washed away, and then it snows and it freezes.
The trenches were flooded quickly and became rivers. Everyone was soaked to the skin. This rain was followed by sleet, and later the wind changed and became a northerly gale with frost.
It was pretty severe. We wore shorts and we wore pith helmets. So when the storm came on, we weren't prepared at all. A lot of men went off with frozen feet, one thing and another. I managed to survive.
I can remember now the night of the storm. Turks were on the top of the hill and we were down at the bottom. We had to get out the trenches all together practically for a little while and get up on the top again to row all halfway up your waist for water.
when they talked about the floods that occurred in November of 1915 and how the water came down from the hills and basically inundated that area where the blockhouse was, where they weren't able to move, up to their waists in freezing water, frostbite and everything else. It must have been terrible and very, very traumatic.
Remember, we're from Newfoundland. We see a lot of snow here. When the trenches started filling up full of water, they just jumped out of the trenches but stayed and held the front line. Lord Kitchener came to visit Gallipoli, and right after he left, they were told they were going to evacuate the Gallipoli Peninsula. The mission was no longer attainable, and there was just using up too much resources because the Western Front was going to be the priority. So on the nights of the 19th and 20th of December, all the people in Suvla Bay were withdrawn. The highest point of any type of success in the Gallipoli campaign were the 2 evacuations. So the night of the 19th and 20th of December, the Newfoundland Regiment, along with the 29th Division and the rest of the Anzac Corps, were withdrawn without losing a single person. So they were evacuated out of Suvla Bay and various harbors and beaches, such as Kangaroo Beach, Little West Beach, and West Beach. In order for the evacuation to be successful, there had to be a point or some type of deception. And one of these deceptions they used was a drip gun. So by adding water to a canteen with a string to the trigger and having the drip longer or shorter or bigger or smaller, as they were withdrawing and even after they were all gone, there were still rifles in the trenches firing. And that was pretty cool. And then on the 22nd of December, the Newfoundland Regiment were told they had to go back to Cape Helles, which is that point where the British originally landed. So they're put into W Beach on the 24th of December, and they spend Christmas there. And we suffer more casualties. On the night of the 8th and 9th of January, 1916, we're withdrawn for the last time out of Lancashire Landing Beach.
We're at the grave of Private George Sims. He died of his wounds on the 30th of December 1915. He had shell wounds to his leg and abdomen, and he was treated here at the 17th Stationary Hospital, Cape Helles, during the second evacuation.
Private John Wallace, number 2378 of the British Forces, Highland Light Infantry. Hometown, St. John's, age 19, died of wounds September 3rd, 1915. Buried Lancashire Landing Cemetery, Gallipoli, Turkey, grave G84.
Private Robert Morris of the Newfoundland Regiment, enlisted in St. John's on the 1st of April 1915 at the age of 28. His hometown was Great Jarvis in Hermitage Bay. He was killed in action January 7th, 1916, killed by a shell blast in the cookhouse. The last Newfoundlander killed in Gallipoli.
The Newfoundland Regiment went to Egypt, and where they trained more and they stayed there, rest, recuperated, and then later in May they went to the Somme by way of Marseille, and they took trains up to a certain point and walked the rest of the way into a town called Louvencourt. And now they're off to the battlefields of France and Flanders. 1,600 will pay the supreme sacrifice. Thousands more will be injured or maimed for life. but they will win a stellar reputation. They will earn their title better than the best. And at the end of the war, monuments to their sacrifices in France and Flanders will be built. But in Gallipoli, it'll take over a century before a monument is built to these brave men.